Mario Rossi was a crew chief and mechanic in NASCAR for over 20 years. He was well respected and beloved across the garage, and had the success to back it up. Rossi was a crew chief for multiple drivers, including Fireball Roberts and Bobby Allison, and won 13 races in NASCAR's top level. He decided to call it quits in 1976, but his retirement didn't last as long as he thought. In 1982, after visiting his family in New Jersey for the Christmas season, his sister dropped him off at the Philadelphia airport to return home to Florida. However, this would be the last time Mario would be seen by his family. On January 2nd, 1983, Mario's sister received a phone call from an unknown woman that told her her brother was dead. Today, we're going to talk about Mario Rossi's mysterious disappearance, the crazy backstory behind it, and the leading theories of what happened. Mario Rossi was born on November 17, 1932, in Trenton, New Jersey. He grew up around automobiles and was interested at a young age. In fact, he successfully tore apart and reassembled an engine for the first time at only 7 years old. Whenever Mario was a teenager, he ran his own auto shop. Mario's ambition and determination for a career in racing only grew, and at age 23, he was able to compete in his first Grand National race. He made the relatively short drive to Langhorne Speedway and finished in 9th place out of 42 runners. Rossi returned the next year and finished 31st after a mechanical issue. Rossi then took part in NASCAR's first Grand National race at Trenton Speedway in 1958 and finished 17th. He then made his fourth and final NASCAR start just a few weeks later at New Oxford, where he finished 25th. Mario must have realized around this time his true calling in NASCAR was not to be a driver, but rather a crew chief and mechanic. He moved to the South in 1959 and began working for Tiger Tom Pistone's crew. In 1959, Tom had his most successful year by a landslide, winning 2 races and recording 11 top 5s. Rossi continued working for Tom through 1960 and the beginning of 1961, until he had a chance to work with a couple all-time greats, Smokey Yunick and Fireball Roberts. The trio had great success, racking up 5 wins in 61 and 62, including Fireball Roberts' Daytona 500 win. However, Rossi moved on in 1963 to crew chief for one of Budmore's new drivers, Darrell Dyringer. Rossi won 5 races with Darrell over the next few years, but Rossi upped his game by fielding his own car in 1968. Darrell was his driver, and despite running well, they didn't find victory lane. In 1969, Rossi paired up with the great Bobby Allison, and the duo won 4 races together. Allison and Rossi had an interesting relationship where Rossi's team, Rossi Engineering, would normally collaborate with Allison on the bigger tracks that gave out higher purses, and they would split the money. This made financial sense, as Allison could show up to the smaller tracks like South Boston, Winston-Salem, and Hickory with his own car and run well. But he needed help on the bigger tracks like Darlington, Michigan, Daytona, and Talladega. In 1970, Allison won 10 races, many of which were under the Rossi Engineering banner, but the two parties parted at the conclusion of 1970. Despite Rossi losing a relationship with NASCAR's top driver, the 1971 Daytona 500 was one of his most infamous moments. After the completion of the 1970 season, Bill France had enough of the special aero cars, such as the Dodge Daytona and Plymouth Superbird. So France restricted them greatly by limiting them to engines that were 205 cubic inches. Despite this, Rossi and his team fielded a Dodge Daytona with a limited engine, and they were the only team to do so. Their driver, Dick Brooks, would lead 5 laps and finish in 7th place. This was the last aero car to ever compete in NASCAR. After this 1971 season, Rossi closed the doors to his team, reportedly because he was not pleased with the direction NASCAR was taking. He did make a brief return in 1973 to work for Dyegard Racing, however that relationship went sour after having many public disagreements with their driver Darrell Waltrip. In 1976, Rossi left DieGuard and NASCAR. Being a successful crew chief and mechanic wasn't Rossi's only achievement, as he contributed to safety as well. Mario created headrests for driver's seats in the late 1960s, reducing neck injuries and whiplash. After the deaths of Joe Weatherly and Billy Wade, Mario designed a new seatbelt with 3 straps instead of just 2. Since then, Mario's design has evolved into today's 9-point restraint system. So after Rossi left NASCAR, he settled in Florida. He was last seen entering Philadelphia International Airport on December 30th, 1982 after visiting his family for Christmas. He was supposed to fly to the Bahamas to use a home he rented. Just 4 days later, his family received the phone call that he had died in a plane crash on the way to the Bahamas. This must have been so unexpected and devastating for the family, as Mario had certainly been looking forward to a vacation. However, as more facts surfaced, the case turned on its head. The January 3rd phone call was actually by a woman calling herself Betty, not any authorities or police. Betty claimed to be Mario's girlfriend. Betty said that Rossi died in an accident in a small private plane that he owned and operated, not a plane that he rented like he told his family. This must have raised some eyebrows, but may have also just been a miscommunication. After all, they were more concerned about Mario's tragic passing. But as time went on, things got weirder. Mario's body was never recovered. The FAA had no record of a plane crash in the Bahamas around that time, and the plane he allegedly crashed in was found to be sold 3 more times after his death. The family received one more phone call, this time a man, telling them specifically not to go to the authorities. So yeah, there is definitely way more to the story. So let's back up a little bit into Mario's personal life around this time. Despite the success on the track, Rossi struggled a lot off track with his financial decisions. Donnie Davis said that Rossi was one of the best mechanics or engine people I knew. I learned everything I know from him, but he was a poor businessman. If he made $1,000 during the day, he'd spend $1,500 that night. Things actually got so bad that by the mid-70s, he and his wife Olivia declared bankruptcy and moved to Atlanta briefly before returning to Florida. He got back into racing at this time, working with former NASCAR driver Gary Below, but he also built motors for boats, as well as doing some work on late models. And I think now is a good time to mention that Below was later put in federal prison for 7 years, for using boats to transport multi-tons of marijuana from Colombia to southern Florida. This is where a couple assumptions can be made, and actually they're not assumptions. 16 years later, Rossi's daughter Tina had this to say. I know he may not have taken drugs then, but he was involved in drugs then, because I remember walking into a few too many deals. They would be using scales to weigh out the drugs, but I really have no idea what they were doing with it. After this, Tina had enough and moved out of her dad's house. I loved him because he was my father before I moved in with him. Then when I lived with him, I learned that he wasn't really into this fatherhood role. So I think that was a shattered vision of what I thought he was. I left angry, went home angry. I didn't talk to him until Christmas. I was still angry at the whole thing. All we said was keep in touch. This Christmas, just 8 months after Tina moved out, was the Christmas of 1982, only days before Mario would go missing. It's also worth noting that what happened in January of 1982, an event which became known as Black Thursday. Earlier, when I mentioned Below being arrested, he wasn't the only one. 4 days after the completion of the Daytona 500, government authorities made 66 arrests in connection to a massive drug operation, including several NASCAR personnel. The first was Rossi's buddy, Gary Below, who had competed in the Daytona 500 just days prior. Another was Billy Harvey, a Cup owner driver who also raced in the Daytona 500. 2 other drivers, Martin Tillman and Bruce Griffin, were also arrested. There were a few other personnel that worked as mechanics. Authorities believed the massive drug operation grossed more than $300 million a year and had been operating since 1976. It was cited at least once. A race car was filled with smuggled marijuana, loaded aboard a trailer, and towed across a state line. The marijuana and allegedly was smuggled into Florida, much of it into the Fort Lauderdale area from the Bahamas. The federal investigation resulting in the indictments had been underway for about 30 months. Federal agents said mechanics whose skill kept stock cars racing around the nation's tracks were also used to tune the fast-powered boats that brought in the marijuana and cocaine. So there's a lot to dig in here. With Rossi's confirmed marijuana dealing with Gary, I think it is 100% safe to assume that at the very least, Rossi knew about the $300 million drug empire. Even if he was just dealing a little bit with Gary to make some extra cash, he surely knew of the operation, especially considering his old driver Tom Pistone was involved. The main debate here is whether Mario was involved or not, and if he was it connected to his mysterious death? I'm not here trying to accuse someone who has been dead for 40 years of doing something, but it seems to me, and a majority of people who know this story very well, that Mario was involved in some way. There are several leading theories of how the drug operation connects to Mario's death. So let's take a look at a couple. So the first theory is that Mario was involved in the operation and had learned or become suspicious about the federal investigation. He was scared and acted as an informant and ratted out all of his partners. He was offered to be in witness protection, but believed he could dodge retaliation from other people involved by lying to them. However, they caught on to the charade and murdered him and set up the plane crash lie to keep his family quiet, and then threatened them once the family started digging for answers. Another theory states that he acted as an informant and actually remains in witness protection today, or did until he eventually died. Another theory says that he only learned of the drug operation through his friends, tipped off the authorities, and then was tracked down by other members of the operation who were not arrested. The final leading theory is that to escape either prosecution from authorities or retaliation from members of the cooperation, Mario made up the elaborate scheme himself, and he actually ran off and started a new life with a new identity. So I have an alternative theory of my own as a NASCAR YouTuber that has watched Breaking Bad and 4 seasons of the Ozarks. I don't necessarily believe this, but it's an interesting thought and I think it could be a potential explanation. Maybe Mario was just desperate. He was in complete financial hardship and had just left the NASCAR industry, which had been his livelihood his entire life up to that point. Gary Below and Mario connected at some point just after Rossi had declared bankruptcy. Gary had some work to offer Mario on his late models and boats, which at the time, Mario may not have known what the boats were for. One day when talking about their finances, Gary mentioned to Mario that he had another way to make money. This is whenever Mario started helping Gary sell some marijuana locally. Once he saw the potential money to be made in his time of desperation, Mario just got too deep into it too fast. He found himself in a matter of months helping a drug empire smuggle drugs across the borders and wanted out. In fear for his safety, he left an anonymous tip to the FBI about what was going on. It took 2.5 years to unfold, but they were finally busted, and Mario was prepared for it and was able to avoid prison. After all, any $300 million operation is going to have more than 66 contributors. Some people had to get away with it. After some time, other members put the pieces together and found out it was Mario. They put the scheme together and successfully got revenge on the man who took their empire away from them. Mario's disappearance still remains a mystery till this day, and it's safe to assume that we will never know truly what happened. Regardless of the mystery, he still left behind his 2 sisters, 2 children, and 2 grandchildren. They had to deal with the tragedy and wrestle with the uncertainty of what happened. This is truly one of the wildest stories in NASCAR, but for now, it remains unsolved.